The New Testament is a compilation of 27 different documents from the first century, most of which are letters. They are among the earliest documents written by Christians. They represent the earliest thinking about Jesus, the very earliest implications about the gospel and the kingdom of God, and the earliest attempts to write down the stories of Jesus that we possess. Out of these 27 documents, just 5 of them are narrative about Jesus and his teachings. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts tell a narrative story. The first 4, the Gospels, tell the story and seek to summarize the life and teachings of Jesus. They primarily focus on his death and resurrection. If you look at any of these, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, you'll see that the majority of their time is spent in the very last week of Jesus' life. Then the books of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, tells the story of Jesus and of the early church after Jesus ascended into heaven. Everything else in the New Testament are letters. Even the book of Revelation was a letter that was written to 7 churches in what is now modern-day Turkey. They were all written to different people or different groups of people, different congregation. With that in mind, let's take a closer look at each one of these books in the New Testament. We begin with Matthew. It is thought that Matthew was first written in Hebrew and later was translated in Greek. You remember that most of the New Testament was written in Greek, but this particular book was written to Jewish people to help convince them that Jesus is the Messiah. Matthew quotes the Old Testament more than any other gospel to help the readers see the connection between how Jesus lived and how he fulfilled what the prophets foretold would come. That's why Matthew is placed right after the Old Testament in our Bible. The Gospel of Mark was probably written at a time when Christians were facing persecution in the city of Rome. Mark seems to be addressing some of the issues connected with these persecutions and how Christians could handle it. It also is the most action-packed gospel. Jesus is performing miracles. He is moving from one place to another. Immediately is a word that you will find often in the book of Mark. The Gospel of Luke was written to Gentiles. All that means is non-Jewish Christians, by someone who was non-Jewish himself. Luke was a doctor, a physician, and likely a traveling companion of Paul. He was particularly concerned for the down and out, the outcasts, and the nobodies of his day. In Luke, Jesus is particularly concerned with sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, and women. We see Jesus spending more time with these folks, those that were considered second-class citizens at the time. John, we believe, wrote his gospel a bit later after the first 3 gospels were written. It was at that time when the Jewish Christians, those who had grown up in the faith of Judaism and had come to Jesus, had been and were being persecuted by the Jews who were not Christians. They were being expelled from the synagogue. In the Gospel of John, there is more of a division between the Jews and the Christians. You will see this conflict as you are reading John's Gospel. John offers a very theologically developed story of Jesus. The author wanted to clarify who Jesus was and Jesus' importance. For example, when John tells the story of the birth of Jesus, there is no mention of a stable or angels or shepherds. Instead, he writes that in the very beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. For John, the Word is Jesus. That helps us understand that Jesus was before all time and is now and will be forever. After the 4 Gospels, we come back to the book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles. Acts has the same author as the Gospel according to Luke and is considered a sequel to Luke's Gospel. Acts tells the story of the beginning of the church just after the death of Peter and Paul. This sets the stage for everything else in the New Testament, which are writings of the apostles to the early church and the Christian communities as they were forming. First up are the writings of Paul, gathered together and organized in 2 groups. First, Paul's letters that are written to churches, and next, Paul's letters that are written to individuals. Within these groups, they're organized by length from longest to shortest, not by spiritual importance. The letters that Paul writes to churches includes Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, all authored by the Apostle Paul to a particular community, to a congregation, encouraging them, helping them to understand what it means to follow after Jesus, who Jesus was, and addressing controversies that they may have. Then we see letters that Paul writes to individuals, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. These are individuals in the life of the early church. Finally comes Hebrews. Now, the early church debated about whether Paul actually wrote Hebrews or not. They eventually decided that he probably did not write Hebrews, but the writing is so similar, it sounds so much like Paul, that they put it next to Paul's writings in the New Testament. Then come what are known as the general epistles. These are letters that, for the most part, are written to large groups of the Christian church. They have specific names associated with them, but they were written to a broad audience. James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. Finally, Revelation comes at the very end because it deals with the end times, the final fulfillment of God's promise to His created people. Everything that will happen at the end of time, including the Lord's return, is included in Revelation. And that's all 27 books of the New Testament.